They bound his hands in front of everyone before the sun had even cleared the ridge, because by their law, a man who shamed a warrior did not walk free beneath the same sky, and Ethan Cole stood there in the red dust with the wind pressing against his back, feeling the weight of eyes he did not understand and judgment that had already been decided long before he could speak a single word, the air thick with the scent of leather, smoke, and something older, something that carried memory like the desert carries heat, slow and unforgiving. And across from him she stood, Nahima Redbird, still as carved stone, her dark hair pulled tight against the breeze, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond him as if he were already gone, and that silence between them said more than any accusation ever could, because 3 days earlier there had been water rushing loud enough to drown out thought, a river turned wild by storm, and a moment that neither of them had asked for, a moment that had broken something neither could name, and now that moment had brought him here, to a place where a man's intention meant less than what others believed they saw, where a torn piece of cloth could speak louder than truth, and the warriors around him did not raise their voices, did not need to, because judgment did not shout out here, it settled in quiet, in the way hands rested near weapons without touching them, in the way boots stayed planted as if the earth itself had decided what came next, and Ethan could feel the grit of sand against his palms as the rope tightened just enough to remind him that he did not belong to himself anymore, not in this circle, not in this moment, and somewhere behind him a horse shifted, leather creaking softly, the sound carrying across the stillness like a warning no one needed explained, because everyone here understood what came after silence, everyone except the man at the center of it. And maybe that was the point, maybe that was how stories like this always began, with one man standing where he was not meant to stand, holding on to a truth that had no place among the eyes that judged him, and Ethan did not look down, did not try to pull free, because something in him understood that any movement now would only confirm what they already believed, and so he stood the way his father had taught him years ago under a different sky. When words failed, you let your stillness speak, you let the dust settle where it may, and you waited, because out here waiting was sometimes the only thing a man had left, and still she did not look at him, not once, her hands resting at her sides, fingers loose but ready, a warrior's calm that did not need to prove itself. And if anyone had asked Ethan in that moment what hurt more, the rope or the silence, he would not have known how to answer, because the rope only held his wrists, but her silence held everything else, and then a low voice began to speak in a language he did not understand, steady and measured, like the turning of something inevitable, and though the words meant nothing to him, the tone did, because tone traveled where language could not, and it carried with it the shape of what was coming, not anger, not chaos, but decision, final and unmoving, and Ethan's eyes drifted once, just once, toward the edge of the circle, where the canyon opened to the pale stretch of desert beyond, miles of open land that only days ago had meant freedom and now meant nothing at all, because distance did not matter when a man could not walk, and he thought then, not of escape, but of the river, of cold water surging against his chest, of hands grabbing for something slipping away, of fabric tearing beneath his grip as he pulled her toward the bank, of breath returning to lungs that had almost lost it, and how in that moment he had not thought of rules or customs or consequences, only of keeping someone alive, and now that same moment stood between him and whatever came next like a shadow that refused to move, and the wind shifted, carrying a trace of sage and ash, brushing past his face, as if the land itself was bearing witness. And somewhere within that quiet, something unseen began to change. Not in the circle, not in the stance of the warriors, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that had nothing to do with ropes or judgment, because out here, the truth did not always rise with voices sometimes. It waited, quiet and patient, for the moment when silence became heavier than any verdict, and Ethan Cole stood at the center of it, not knowing yet that the story they believed they were ending had only just begun. The man who spoke stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that made even the wind seem to hold its breath. Older than the others, his hair threaded with gray and tied back with leather, his eyes steady not with anger, but with something far heavier, something that did not need to rise in volume to be heard, and though Ethan did not understand the words, he understood the weight behind them, the way every syllable landed like a stone placed carefully into the ground, building something that could not be undone once complete. And the circle of warriors shifted just slightly, not breaking formation, only tightening it, like a boundary being drawn without a line. And Ethan felt that shift more than he saw it, the subtle change that said this was no longer about what might happen, but about what would. And still Nehema did not move, her posture unchanged, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond his shoulder as if she were watching a horizon only she could see. And for a moment, just a moment, Ethan wondered if she would speak, if she would step forward and say something that would change the direction of this quiet storm, but she did not, and that absence spoke louder than anything she could have said, because silence from her carried meaning, and meaning out here was everything. And the older man reached into a small pouch at his side, drawing out something that caught the morning light for the briefest second, a fragment of fabric, worn and darkened by water and time, edges uneven where it had been torn, and when he held it up, the air itself seemed to shift, as if the object carried more than its weight, as if it held a story everyone here already knew, everyone except the man it was being shown to. And Ethan's eyes settled on it, recognition coming slow and heavy, not because he had forgotten, but because he had not realized what that moment had become in the eyes of others. Because to him it had been nothing more than a necessity, a choice made in the space between life and loss. But here, now, it was something else entirely, something that could not be explained away with simple words. And the older man spoke again, his voice steady, measured, each word deliberate. And though Ethan could not follow the language, he did not need to, because the meaning was clear in the way the warriors around him held themselves, in the way their attention sharpened, in the way their stillness deepened rather than broke. And Ethan's hands tightened instinctively against the rope, not in resistance but in memory, because 3 days earlier those same hands had been fighting against a current that did not care who survived, had been gripping fabric that would not hold, had been pulling against a force that wanted to take more than it gave. And he could feel it again now, the cold, the weight, the urgency of that moment when there had been no time to think, only to act. And he remembered the sound most of all, not the river, not the storm, but the sharp tear of cloth giving way under strain, a sound that had meant survival then, and now meant something entirely different. And the older man lowered the fabric slightly, his gaze shifting toward Nehema for the first time since he had begun speaking. And though she did not move, something in the set of her shoulders changed, subtle enough that no one else might notice. But Ethan saw it, because when a man stands at the center of judgment, he notices everything, every breath, every shift, every moment that might tip the balance one way or the other. And for a fraction of a second, her eyes flickered, not to him, but to the fabric, and then away again. And in that brief movement, there was something else, something that did not belong to anger or accusation, something quieter, something unresolved, and it passed as quickly as it came, leaving nothing behind but the same stillness she had worn since he arrived. And the older man turned back toward Ethan, stepping closer now. Not threatening, not aggressive, just near enough that the space between them carried weight. And he spoke once more, slower this time, as if offering something final, something that would not be repeated. And Ethan held his ground, not because he was unafraid, but because there was nowhere else to go. And in that moment, fear felt less important than understanding, because if this was how it ended, he wanted to know why, even if the words never reached him. And the wind moved again, brushing across the circle, lifting dust in a thin line that drifted between them like a boundary no one crossed. And then it settled, and with it, the last trace of movement faded, leaving only the quiet, the kind, that comes before something changes. And though no one had raised a voice, no one had made a sudden move, Ethan could feel it, the moment drawing closer, the point where silence would give way to action. And still, through it all, Nehema Redbird stood apart, neither joining the judgment nor breaking it, her presence alone holding a space that did not belong to either side. And somewhere deep in that stillness, something waited, something that had not yet been spoken, something that would decide whether the story ended here in the dust, or turned in a direction none of them had expected. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and tight like a wire pulled across open land, and then, without warning, it shifted not with sound but with memory, because Ethan's mind pulled him backward to the river where all of this had begun, where the sky had turned the color of iron and the wind had carried rain in hard, slanted sheets that stung the skin and blurred the distance into something uncertain. And he had been riding alone along the canyon edge, tracking nothing more than a stray hoof print that had already begun to fade in the mud, when the sound reached him, not loud, not clear, just wrong enough to make him stop. A human voice carried through water and storm, and that was all it took, because out here a man learned the difference between noise and need, and this was need, sharp and urgent, cutting through the storm like a signal meant for only one pair of ears, and he had turned his horse without thinking, boots pressing into the stirrups as he guided the animal down a slope that had no business being ridden in that weather, loose rock shifting beneath hooves, the smell of wet earth rising thick and heavy, and when he reached the river it was no longer a river at all but something alive, something that moved with force and purpose, and in the middle of it she was there, not standing, not swimming, but caught, pulled by a current that did not ask permission, her form half lost beneath the surface, dark hair whipping across her face as she fought for something that kept slipping away. And there had been no time to consider who she was or what she might mean, because the moment did not wait for questions, and Ethan had already been moving before the thought fully formed, sliding from the saddle and stepping into water that hit like cold iron, the force of it nearly taking his footing in the first second, but he pushed forward anyway, because stopping meant watching, and watching meant losing her. And that was not something he had ever learned how to do, and when he reached her, it was not graceful, not controlled, just hands finding fabric, finding weight, pulling against something that resisted every inch, and for a brief second their eyes met, not in understanding, not in trust, but in something far simpler, the recognition that survival sometimes comes from strangers, and then the fabric tore, sharp and sudden, the sound cutting through the storm like a crack, and he felt it give in his grip as he shifted his hold, not thinking of what that tear might mean beyond the next breath, beyond the next step toward shore. And when they reached the bank, it was not a victory, just an ending to one kind of danger and the beginning of another, because she pulled away from him the moment her feet found ground, not with gratitude, not with relief, but with something else entirely, something that made him pause, hands lifting slightly as if to show he meant no harm, though harm was already written across the torn edges of what she wore, and she had looked at him then, really looked, her eyes sharp despite the storm, searching not for kindness, but for consequence, and she had said nothing at first, only stepped back, one hand gripping what remained of her clothing as if holding it together could hold something else in place, something unseen but just as important, and Ethan had felt it then, that he had crossed into something he did not understand, not by choice, not by intention, but by action, and before he could speak, before he could offer anything that might bridge that gap, the sound had come from above, not the storm, not the river, but something human, something that carried across distance with purpose, and when he looked up, they were already there, shapes along the ridge, still and watching, their presence turning the moment from private to something far larger, and in that instant, the meaning of what had happened shifted, not in truth, but in perception, and out here, perception had a way of becoming reality faster than any explanation could catch it, and Nahima had turned toward them, her voice rising in words he did not understand, urgent and controlled at the same time, and he had stood there, water dripping from his sleeves, the torn fabric still in his hand, realizing too late that saving a life did not always look like salvation to those who saw only the surface, and now, standing again in the dry heat of morning, with that same piece of fabric held before him like a verdict, Ethan Cole understood something he had not then, that moments do not end when the danger passes, they carry forward, reshaped by the eyes that witness them, and sometimes the hardest part is not what you did, but what others believe you have done. The memory did not fade when the storm ended. It followed them both in the quiet that came after, in the space where words should have been but were not, and back on that riverbank the rain had softened to a steady whisper against the earth, the sky still heavy but no longer angry, and Ethan had stood there unsure whether to step forward or step away, because every instinct told him that moving wrong now would turn something fragile into something broken beyond repair, and Nehema had not run, had not called out again to the figures on the ridge. Instead, she had stayed, her breathing steadying, her posture shifting from survival to something else, something guarded, and she had looked at him not as a man who saved her, but as a man who had crossed a line he could not see. And when she finally spoke in English, her voice carried no warmth, no gratitude, only clarity, telling him to leave, telling him that whatever he thought he had done did not belong here, and Ethan had nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding that explanation would not change what had already been seen, and he had taken a step back, then another, giving her space that felt less like distance and more like respect, because out here respect was sometimes the only language that mattered. And still he had not turned his back, not until she did first, and when she did it was deliberate, a choice that told him the moment between them was not finished, only paused, and he had walked then, boots sinking slightly into wet ground, the sound of water still rushing behind him, the weight of something unspoken settling into his chest as heavy as any storm, and he had not gone far, not as far as he should have, because something held him there, something he could not name, but could not ignore, and from the cover of rock and brush he had watched as the warriors descended from the ridge, silent and controlled, surrounding her not with panic but with presence, their attention shifting immediately to the torn fabric, to the marks left behind by a moment they had not witnessed fully but believed they understood, and Nehema had spoken to them quickly, her voice steady, her hands moving in small gestures that carried meaning Ethan could not follow, and for a moment, just a moment, it had seemed like they might listen, like the story might shift before it settled into place, but then one of them had stepped closer, lifting the edge of that torn cloth with careful fingers, not accusing, not aggressive, just confirming what their eyes had already decided, and the shift in the air had been immediate, subtle but undeniable, the kind of change that does not need to be announced because everyone feels it at the same time. And Ethan had known then that whatever she said would be measured against what they saw, and what they saw would weigh more, and he had almost stepped forward, almost revealed himself, almost tried to bridge that distance with words that would likely fall short. But he had stopped because he saw her glance once in his direction, not directly at him but near enough that the meaning carried, a warning, a choice, and in that look was something unexpected, not fear, not anger, but control, as if she were deciding not just what would happen next but how it would be remembered, and so he had stayed hidden, not out of fear for himself, but out of something that felt like trust, though he could not have explained why, and the warriors had led her away then. Not roughly, not forcefully, but with a purpose that left no room for refusal, and the distance between them had grown not just in steps but in understanding, and Ethan had remained there long after they disappeared from view, the rain easing into silence, the river returning to something calmer, as if the world itself had decided the moment had passed, and yet it had not, because now, standing again before those same people, with that same piece of fabric held as proof, Ethan understood that leaving that day had not ended anything, it had only delayed the moment when all of it would return, reshaped and heavier, and as the wind moved softly through the circle once more, carrying the faint scent of sage and damp earth, he realized that what he had done was never the question, it was what they believed he had done that mattered, and somewhere within that difference lay the truth that had yet to be spoken, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the open. The older man lowered the torn fabric just enough for the light to slip off its edges, and in that small movement the entire circle seemed to lean closer without stepping forward, as if the story held in that fragment demanded to be seen from every angle before judgment could settle completely, and Ethan felt the weight of it more now than he had before, not because the cloth itself meant anything to him, but because of what it meant to them, because out here meaning was not owned by the man who acted, it was owned by those who witnessed, and he could see it in their faces, in the quiet tension held behind steady eyes. They were not asking what happened. They believed they already knew, and that belief stood between him and any chance of being understood. And the older man spoke again, slower this time, his tone carrying something that felt less like accusation and more like conclusion, And even without understanding the words, Ethan could hear the shape of it, the way the sound settled at the end like a door closing, and still no one moved. No one reached for him. No one raised a voice, because this was not chaos. This was order, a kind of order built on tradition older than anything Ethan had ever known. And in the center of it all, Nehima finally shifted, just a step, small enough that it might have been missed if not for the way the circle reacted, not breaking, not changing, but acknowledging, because her movement mattered here. Her presence was not just part of the story, it was part of the decision, and for the first time since he had been brought into that circle, her eyes lifted, not to meet his, but close enough that he could see them clearly, steady, unreadable, carrying something deeper than anger, something that made him hold his breath without realizing it, and she spoke then, her voice calm, measured, cutting clean through the stillness without raising itself, and though the language was not his, the rhythm was, because truth has a way of carrying through tone, through pace, through the absence of hesitation, and the older man listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but the space between them shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a scale adjusting under weight no one else could see, and Ethan stood there with the rope tight around his wrists, knowing this moment was not about him anymore. It had moved beyond him, beyond what he could explain or defend. It belonged to her now, to what she chose to say or not say, and for the first time since this began, he understood something that had not been clear before, that she had protected him once already, not with words, but with silence on that riverbank, and now whatever came next would not be decided by what he did, but by what she allowed to be believed. And the wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of distant movement somewhere beyond the circle, a reminder that the world outside this moment still existed, still turned, but here time held its place, waiting, and when she finished speaking she did not step back, did not lower her gaze. She simply stood, letting the silence return, and in that silence something began to change, not loudly, not suddenly, but enough that Ethan could feel it, like the first sign of rain before it falls, and though he did not yet know what that change would bring, he knew this. The story they had built around him was no longer fixed, and somewhere within the quiet space between her words and their judgment, a different truth had begun to take shape. The silence that followed her words did not feel the same as before. It carried weight now, not of judgment already made, but of something reconsidered, something unsettled, and the older man did not speak immediately, which in itself shifted the balance more than any argument could have, because hesitation from a man like him meant the ground beneath certainty had begun to move. And Ethan felt it in the way the air no longer pressed as hard against his chest, in the way the circle around him held its shape but lost a fraction of its tension, like a rope loosened by a single inch, and Nehima remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, her face still composed, but there was something different now in the stillness she carried, not defiance, not submission, something quieter, something that belonged only to her, and Ethan realized then that whatever she had said had not been for him, it had been for them, for the people who would decide what his actions meant, and the older man finally moved, not stepping forward but turning slightly, his gaze sweeping across the warriors as if measuring not their strength but their agreement, and one by one, subtle as breath, small shifts answered him, a tilt of a chin, a tightening of a jaw, a stillness that said they were listening not just to him now but to her as well, and that was new, that had not been there before, and Ethan's hands flexed slightly against the rope, not to test it but to remind himself he was still bound, still at the center of something that had not yet resolved, and the older man spoke again, slower than before, his tone carrying less certainty, more weight, as if each word now had to carry both what was believed and what had just been introduced. And though Ethan could not follow the language, he understood the change in it, because tone does not lie the way words sometimes can, and this tone held consideration, and that was enough to shift something inside him, something that had been bracing for an ending that now felt less certain, and the fragment of fabric was lowered further. No longer held as high, no longer the single point of focus, and that alone said more than any explanation, because when proof is lowered, it means doubt has found a place to stand, and Nehima's eyes moved then, Not quickly, not openly, but just enough to meet Ethan's for the first time since the river, and in that brief connection there was no apology, no request, only recognition, as if both of them understood that what had happened between them could not be undone, only redefined. And the moment passed as quickly as it came, her gaze returning forward, her expression unchanged, but something had been said without words, something that did not belong to the tribe or to Ethan, something that belonged only to that moment they shared and the truth that lived inside it, and the wind carried a faint sound from beyond the ridge, distant hooves or shifting brush, nothing immediate, but enough to remind everyone that time did not stop for decisions, that whatever was being decided here would soon have to exist in a world that kept moving, and the older man took a single step closer to Ethan, not as a threat, but as a measure, as if closing the distance might bring clarity where words could not, and he studied Ethan's face, searching for something, not guilt, not fear, but truth, the kind that cannot be spoken but can sometimes be seen, and Ethan did not look away, because there was nothing left to hide. And in that quiet exchange, something passed between them, not agreement, not forgiveness, but understanding that this was no longer a simple story of offense and consequence. It had become something more complicated, something that required more than a single answer. And as the silence settled again, softer now, less rigid, Ethan felt the weight on his shoulders shift, not gone, not lifted, but changed, like a storm that had not ended, but had begun to move in a different direction. The older man did not speak again right away, and that silence spread outward through the circle like a slow ripple across still water, touching each warrior, without breaking them, and for the first time since Ethan had been brought there, the circle did not feel closed. It felt waiting, as if something unfinished hovered just above the ground, refusing to settle, and then a younger warrior stepped forward from the edge, not rushing, not challenging, but carrying a different kind of weight, the kind that came from belief rather than authority, and his eyes moved from Ethan to Nehima and back again, sharper, less patient, and when he spoke his voice carried more edge, not louder, but firmer, like a man unwilling to let uncertainty take root where tradition had always stood firm, and though Ethan did not understand the words, he understood the direction of them, the way the younger man gestured briefly toward the torn fabric, toward Ethan, toward the ground beneath their feet, drawing a line that needed no language to be clear, and the circle responded in small ways, a shift of stance, a tightening of shoulders, the kind of movement that said doubt was not shared by all, that not everyone was ready to let the story change, and the older man turned his head slightly, listening, not interrupting, but not yielding either, and Nehima remained still, though something in her posture sharpened, not outwardly, not enough to draw attention, but enough that Ethan could see it, the way a blade catches light even when it does not move, and the tension returned, not as strong as before, but present, threading its way through the space that had briefly opened, and Ethan felt it settle again in his chest, that familiar pressure of being measured by something he could not answer directly, and for a moment it seemed the circle might close again, that whatever shift had begun would be pulled back into certainty by those who needed it. And then Nehima moved, not stepping forward, not raising her voice, but lifting her hand just slightly, enough to interrupt without force, and when she spoke again it was different this time, not just steady, but deliberate, each word placed carefully, not rushed, not defensive, but chosen, and though Ethan could not follow the language, he felt the change in it, because this was no longer explanation, this was declaration, and the younger warrior's expression tightened, his stance holding firm, but he did not interrupt, and that alone meant her words carried weight he could not dismiss, and the older man watched her closely now, not the fabric, not Ethan, but her, as if the truth of the moment rested not in what had happened but in how she chose to stand within it, and Ethan found himself watching her too, not for what she said, but for what she did not say, for the spaces between her words, for the way her voice held steady without rising, for the way she did not look at him even now, and yet somehow still included him in what she was shaping, and when she finished, the silence that followed felt different again, not uncertain this time, but balanced, as if two versions of the same story now stood side by side, neither fully overtaking the other, and the wind passed through once more, lifting a thin line of dust that moved between them and then settled, as if marking the space where the decision would fall, and Ethan stood there, still bound, still at the center, but no longer alone in the weight of what had happened, because now the story belonged to more than one voice, and in that shared space, something new had begun to take form, something that would not be decided by force or fear, but by who had the courage to hold their ground when silence demanded an answer. The younger warrior did not step back, but he did not step forward either, and that hesitation revealed more than any challenge could have, because a man certain of his ground does not pause, he moves, and this pause, brief as it was, carried through the circle like a quiet admission that the ground beneath them was no longer as firm as it had been moments before, and the older man saw it, weighing it without turning his head, his gaze still steady, still measuring, and then something unexpected happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to shift the shape of everything, because one of the warriors at the far edge lowered his stance, just slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing, and another followed, not in surrender, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the story was no longer singular, that there were now two truths standing side by side, and neither could be ignored without consequence, and Ethan felt it in the air, that subtle release, like the moment before a storm breaks but chooses instead to pass overhead, and still the rope remained around his wrists, a quiet reminder that nothing had been decided yet, only reconsidered, and Nehima stood unmoving, but there was a shift in her breathing now, slower, steadier, as if she had crossed a line within herself and would not step back from it, and the older man finally moved again, stepping not toward Ethan this time, but toward her, closing the distance between them with deliberate calm, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, not doubt, not certainty, but respect, the kind that comes when a voice has been heard and cannot be dismissed, and Nehima listened without lowering her gaze, without breaking the stillness she had built around herself, and when she answered, it was quieter, not weaker, but more precise, as if the space no longer required force, only truth. And Ethan watched them both, understanding none of the words, but all of the weight, because this was no longer about what he had done or what they believed. It had become something else, something that lived between their worlds, where intention and tradition met and did not always agree, and the younger warrior shifted again, his jaw tightening, but he did not interrupt, and that silence from him carried its own meaning, because even resistance must choose when to speak, and he had chosen not to, and that choice allowed the moment to continue, allowed it to grow into something that could not be forced back into its original shape, and the wind moved softly across the circle, lifting dust that caught the morning light before settling again. And in that quiet motion Ethan felt something settle inside him as well, not relief, not safety, but a kind of acceptance, because he understood now that whatever came next would not be decided by him, and for the first time, that did not feel like weakness, it felt like trust, not blind, not certain, but real. And then the older man turned back toward him, his eyes steady, searching once more, but differently now, not for proof of wrongdoing, but for something else, something that could align with what had been said, and Ethan held that gaze without flinching, because there was nothing left to hide, and in that quiet exchange, without a single word shared between them, something passed, something that did not resolve the moment, but changed its direction, and as the circle held, no longer tightening, no longer closing, Ethan Cole understood that the story that had brought him here was no longer leading to a single end. It had opened, and in that opening lay a choice that none of them could ignore. The circle did not close again, and that was the first sign that something deeper than judgment had taken hold, because out here decisions were rarely undone once formed, and yet here they stood, suspended between what was expected and what had been revealed, and the older man lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in doubt, but in reflection, as if weighing not only the moment, but the meaning behind it, and when he looked up again, it was not at Ethan, not at the younger warrior, but at Nehima, and that choice alone shifted the balance further than any word could have, because authority that turns toward truth instead of tradition does not do so lightly, and Nehema did not move, did not react outwardly, but something in the air between them steadied, as if the ground beneath her had settled in a way that would not shift again. And then the older man spoke, his voice lower now, quieter, but carrying farther than before, because it did not need force, it carried clarity. And, though Ethan could not understand the language, he understood the rhythm, the way each word was placed without hesitation, without retreat, and this time, when the words ended, there was no immediate response. From the circle, no ripple of tension, no tightening of stance, only stillness, the kind that comes when something final has been spoken, and the younger warrior shifted his weight once, his jaw tightening as if holding back a response that no longer had a place to land, and that restraint said more than defiance ever could, because even resistance must yield when the ground beneath it no longer holds, and Ethan stood there, the rope still firm around his wrists, but no longer feeling like a sentence, more like a remnant of a moment that had already begun to pass, and the older man stepped closer again, not stopping this time until he stood within arm's reach, his eyes fixed on Ethan's face with a quiet intensity that searched not for guilt but for alignment, for something that matched what had just been spoken, and Ethan met that gaze without turning away, because there was nothing left to defend, only something to stand within. And for a brief moment the world narrowed to that space between them, the dust, the wind, the presence of others fading into something distant. And then the older man reached out, not quickly, not forcefully, but with deliberate calm, and his hand moved to the rope, fingers brushing against it, as if confirming its presence rather than its purpose, and the circle did not react. No one stepped forward. No one spoke, because they understood that whatever came next would not be challenged, and in that quiet, measured motion, the rope loosened. Not fully, not yet, but enough to change its meaning, enough to say that what had been bound by assumption was now being reconsidered by truth, and Ethan felt the shift immediately, not in his hands, but in his chest, in the way the weight he had carried since the river began to move, not lifting, but settling into something different, something that no longer pressed down but held steady, and Nehema watched it happen without stepping forward, without claiming it, her presence unchanged. But there was something in her stillness now that felt complete, as if the part she had needed to play had been fulfilled without needing to be spoken aloud, and the wind moved once more through the circle, softer. Now, carrying with it the quiet understanding that something had ended without anyone needing to say it, and as the rope hung looser around his wrists, Ethan Cole understood that the story that had brought him here was no longer about what had been taken or torn. It had become something else entirely, something built not on what was seen, but on what someone chose to stand for when it mattered most. The rope did not fall away completely, but it no longer held him the same, and that difference carried more meaning than freedom ever could, because out here a man was not judged by whether he stood unbound, but by whether those around him chose to see him differently, and the older man stepped back, giving space not as a dismissal, but as a sign that the moment had shifted beyond his hands, and the circle responded in kind, not breaking, not dispersing, but easing, the tension that had once held it tight now loosening into something quieter, something that allowed breath where before there had only been pressure, and Ethan lowered his hands slightly, not testing the rope, not pulling against it, just letting them rest in a way that showed he understood what had been given and what had not, and that restraint did not go unnoticed, because respect out here was measured in what a man chose not to do, and Nehema finally moved, stepping forward for the first time since the river had brought them together, her steps measured, steady, the dust shifting softly beneath her boots as she closed the distance between them, and when she stopped, it was not beside him, not behind him, but just within reach, a position that belonged to neither side but acknowledged both, and for a moment she said nothing, her gaze resting on the rope, on his hands, on the space between them, and then she lifted her hand, not to remove the rope, not to claim him, but to touch the fabric fragment still held by the older man, her fingers brushing it lightly before she took it into her own hand, and that single action carried a weight no voice could match, because the object that had stood as proof now rested with the one it had been meant to define, and she held it there, not hiding it, not raising it, simply holding it as if its meaning had changed the moment it passed into her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but it carried farther because it did not push. It settled, each word placed with care, and though Ethan could not understand the language, he understood the effect because the circle did not tighten, did not question. It listened, and in that listening something deeper took root, something that did not belong to law or tradition alone, but to the space where both could bend without breaking. And when she finished, she did something no one expected, something that shifted the ground beneath them all without force, because she stepped back, just one step, and in doing so, she placed herself not in front of him, not against him, but beside the truth she had chosen to carry, and the older man watched her closely, his expression unchanged, but his eyes holding something that had not been there before, not doubt, not certainty, but recognition, as if he saw now not just the moment, but the path that had led to it, and the younger warrior lowered his gaze for the first time, not in defeat, but in acceptance that the story he had held onto no longer stood alone, and the wind passed through again, soft and steady, lifting the edge of Nahima's hair, brushing against Ethan's face, carrying with it the quiet understanding that something had been resolved without ever being declared, and as the circle held in that new stillness, neither closing nor breaking, Ethan Cole understood that what had begun as a misunderstanding had become something far more rare, something that could not be forced or claimed, only recognized, and in that recognition, something unspoken had been given back to him, not by words, not by release, but by the simple act of someone choosing to stand within the truth when it would have been easier to remain silent. No one spoke when she stepped back, and that absence of sound carried more finality than any verdict ever could, because out here decisions were not always sealed with words. Sometimes they settled into place through what was no longer contested, and the circle, once tight with purpose, now held a different shape, not broken, not dissolved, but open just enough to let something new exist within it, and Ethan stood there with the loosened rope still around his wrists, feeling the shift not in the fibers against his skin but in the space around him, the way the air no longer pressed inward but seemed to move freely again, and the older man turned once more, not toward Ethan, not toward Nahima, but toward the warriors who had stood witness to it all, and his gaze moved slowly across them, not demanding agreement, not seeking approval, but acknowledging that what had been decided here belonged to all of them now, and one by one, in ways so subtle they might have been missed by anyone not standing in the center of it, they responded, a slight lowering of the head, a shift in stance, the quiet release of tension that said the moment had passed its point of conflict, and the younger warrior who had once held firm now looked away, not out of shame, not out of defeat, but out of recognition that the ground he had stood on had changed beneath him, and even he could not deny it, and the wind moved again, brushing softly across the circle, carrying with it the scent of dust and sage and something else, something that felt like closure, and the older man stepped forward once more, this time not to measure or judge, but to finish what had already begun, and with careful hands he loosened the rope fully, letting it fall away without ceremony, without announcement, because none was needed, and Ethan lowered his arms slowly, not rushing the movement, not testing the freedom, just letting it settle into him as quietly as it had been given, and for a moment he did not move beyond that, did not step forward or back, because leaving too quickly would have broken something that had taken more than words to build, and Nahima remained where she was, the fragment of fabric still in her hand, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, but there was something in her stillness now that felt complete, as if the weight she had carried since the river had finally found its place, and then, without looking at him directly, she turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge his presence, without drawing attention to it, and that small movement said more than anything else could have because it did not claim him, did not separate him, it simply allowed him to exist within the same space without conflict, and Ethan understood that for what it was, not forgiveness, not acceptance in full, but something real, something earned in the quiet space between action and truth, and the circle began to loosen further, not dispersing in haste, but easing apart as if guided by something unspoken, each warrior stepping back into their own place within the land, their attention no longer fixed on him, and as the space opened around him, Ethan took a single step back, not turning his back, not breaking the line of respect, just creating distance in the same careful way it had been given, and for the first time since the storm, since the river, since the moment that had torn more than fabric, he felt something settle within him that had not been there before, not relief, not victory, but understanding, the kind that comes when a man realizes that truth does not always need to be spoken to be recognized, and as the wind carried the last traces of tension away into the open land beyond, Ethan Cole stood there for one final moment, no longer bound, no longer judged, but marked in a way that would remain long after he walked away, and somewhere behind him, though he did not turn to see it, Nehemiah Redbird still stood, holding the fragment that had once defined the story. Now no longer proof of anything except the quiet truth that had changed everything. He did not leave right away, even though the path away from the circle had opened and no one stood in his way anymore, because out here walking away too quickly could erase something that had just been built with care, and Ethan Cole understood that some moments asked for stillness, even after they had passed, so he stood there for a few breaths longer, the wind brushing lightly against his sleeves. The faint creak of leather somewhere behind him reminding him that the world had already begun to move again, and slowly he turned, not abruptly, not breaking the quiet respect that had settled over the ground, but with the same measured calm that had carried him through the center of it all, and he took a step forward, then another, each one deliberate, each one carrying him away without closing the space entirely, because distance did not have to mean separation, and he could feel their eyes on him still, not sharp, not judging, just present, as if the story that had unfolded would remain with them long after he disappeared beyond the ridge. And he did not look back at first, not because he did not want to, but because turning too soon would have pulled something back into words that had been resolved without them, and so he walked, boots pressing into the dry earth, the sound steady, grounded, real, and only when he reached the edge of the circle, where the land opened into wide silence, did he pause, just briefly, and turn his head slightly, not fully, just enough to see her standing there among her people, unchanged in posture, yet different in presence. Nehemiah Redbird, holding that small fragment in her hand, no longer a symbol of accusation, but something else, something neither of them needed to name, and their eyes met for a single moment, not long enough to hold, not distant enough to forget, and in that brief exchange there was no promise, no claim, only recognition, the kind that does not bind but does not fade either, and then he turned forward again, continuing on without hesitation, because whatever had been given between them did not need to be carried in his hands, it had already found its place somewhere deeper, and behind him the circle did not reform, did not close as it once had. Instead it remained open, the warriors returning to their quiet positions within the land, the moment dissolving into the rhythm of life that did not stop for any one story, and Nehemiah did not follow, did not call out, because some connections are not meant to be chased, they are meant to be understood. And she stood there as the wind lifted the edge of her hair, the fragment still, resting lightly in her hand, and after a long moment she lowered it, not discarding it, not hiding it, just letting it rest at her side as if its purpose had already been fulfilled, and the older man watched her, then the path where Ethan had gone, his expression unchanged, but his eyes carrying the quiet knowledge that something rare had passed through their circle that morning, something that would not be spoken of in loud voices, but would be remembered in the way silence held a different meaning from that day forward, and as the sun climbed higher, casting longer light across the open land, the dust settled, the wind softened, and the space where judgment had once stood remained, not empty, but transformed, and far beyond the ridge, Ethan Cole continued walking without looking back again, because he did not need to, not anymore. The story did not follow him like a shadow. It stayed behind like something rooted, something that belonged to the place where it had been understood, and though no words had been exchanged between them in a language they both shared, something had been said all the same, something that did not end when the distance grew, something that would remain quiet and steady, like the land itself. The land swallowed distance the way it always had, slow and certain, until the figure of Ethan Cole became just another moving shape against the wide horizon, and then even that was gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint trace of footsteps that the wind would soon erase. And yet something remained, not in the dust, not in the air, but in the quiet that settled over the place where he had stood. Because silence after a moment like that is never empty, it holds what words cannot carry. And back within the loose circle that was no longer a circle, Nahima Redbird remained still, her gaze resting on the space where he had disappeared, not searching, not waiting, just acknowledging, as if that line between presence and absence had become something she could see clearly now, and the fragment of fabric in her hand felt lighter than it had before, not because its weight had changed, but because its meaning had. And after a long breath she lifted it once more, not for others to see, not as proof, but as something private now, something that belonged to a moment no one else had fully witnessed. And then she did something simple, something that carried no ceremony, yet meant everything. She folded it carefully and tucked it into the leather cord at her wrist, binding it there without tightening it, letting it rest as part of her rather than apart from her. And no one spoke as she did it, because no one needed to. The older man watched with quiet understanding, his eyes steady, knowing that some decisions are not declared, they are lived. And the younger warrior turned away at last, not in rejection, but in acceptance that what had been chosen would stand beyond his disagreement. And one by one the others moved, not gathering, not dispersing with urgency, just returning to the rhythm of the land, their step soft, their presence fading into the space that had always belonged to them. And the wind passed through again, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage, brushing across Nahima's face, as if marking the end of something that had not needed a beginning. And she stood there a moment longer, feeling that quiet settle fully, feeling the absence of tension where it had once pressed against her chest. And then she turned as well, not toward where he had gone, but toward the path that lay ahead of her, because whatever had passed between them did not ask to be followed. It asked to be remembered, and memory out here did not live in words. It lived in choices, in the way a person stood when it mattered, in the way silence was held instead of broken. And as she walked, her step steady, the fragment resting against her wrist, she carried with her not a story of shame or defense, but something quieter, something stronger, the knowledge that truth does not need to be spoken loudly to be seen. And far beyond the ridge, where the land stretched open and endless, Ethan Cole walked on beneath the rising sun. The weight he had carried now settled into something he did not need to name, because out here, the deepest things rarely had names. They simply existed, like the wind, like the land, like the quiet. Understanding that sometimes the strongest bond between two people is not built through words or promises, but through a single moment where one chooses to stand in truth while the other chooses to trust it. And then both walk away, carrying it in silence.